So, Blindness by José Saramago. Came out in 1995 and was one of his later career. I think. So Saramago died in 2010, so not that long ago, and he was a Portuguese writer, and he. So by the time he wrote this, I think he saw quite a bit, and he came from a point of view of the various political uprisings throughout his own home country, and and maybe taking some comfort in leaving that and trying to get away from that. And I've heard, as much as I've yet to have learned about Saramago, I've really only just got into this maybe. I want to say I finished this maybe a few weeks ago, so I'm still fairly fresh in my mind as far as, which is contrary to what's my normal kind of habit of losing information. But there's a lot to draw from this novel. It is like I said, Saramago's own life of seeing failed kind of communism and seeing people and how quick people kind of turn into animals, kind of, and how savage and inhumane people are willing to get just to kind of get across a political kind of idea or to provoke a revolution or do whatever. And this all happens kind of in cycles too. And but basically Blindness concerns a society that's kind of, it's kind of set in a detached kind of realm where maybe a bit I want to say the glass bead game, just in the sense that it's not completely obvious if this is a because none of the characters have names either. All of them are referred to as the blind man and the blind woman, or the doctor or the nurse, or the thief. So you have a lot of kind of archetypal things, the old man kind of play a part, and they all kind of come together, and it's almost like they're walking kind of foils to each other. They're it's almost like they're drafted in a way. It's almost like this novel itself too. I've heard people criticize the reading style of just the kind of long. There's no chapters though. So when you look in the table of contents, if there is any, I'm not sure if you really get much. You go through it and it's meant to, you get breaks like this. Paragraph breaks, which are pretty much kind of similar to chapter breaks, just for the sake of sanity, I guess, because some people kind of say that reading this is kind of maddening and delirious in a way. I didn't quite get that, but maybe it's just because I read some fairly dark stuff recently too, with 2666 or by Blindness, or just stuff maybe I'm just a little bit used to it, but I do get that, some people need that break. They need things to make sense, and it's but for me it was kind of right up my alley in some sense, because maybe just the way my brain kind of works in a stream of conscious way naturally, but not saying that's a good thing necessarily, but there's a lot. So it's in this isolated event of blindness. And it starts off telling us about the blind man, how he's driving, and and then all of a sudden everything turns to white. And the kind of blindness happening here isn't a blindness of old age. It's not you grow old and then you start losing your vision and you start getting what's the word? You start it's not kind of senescence or induced blindness or anything that's kind of a easily curable type of thing, because all of it is a very mysterious kind of almost black, not like a black cloud, but almost a mysterious. It's not from Lost, but it's it's you can catch it, the blindness. It's I'm completely blanking on the word. You can catch it. So it's contagious. Jesus, wow. The blindness is contagious. Other people can get blindness if you touch, or I think, and interact with them on a certain basis. Some of it's like, all it takes is like literally just a handshake. Sometimes it's just like proximity. A lot of people cloister together, and that, causes mass blindness among masses. So this is like a very interesting kind of thought experiment too, philosophically, or just in humanity wise, in just the context of what it would be like to lose your vision, because it's like, so we walk and talk, we interact with one another, and we take our vision for granted so easily that we don't really think too much about it. Like, what if we did, if we negatively visualized in a kind of stoical sense of like, if we just lost this kind of capacity for vision, like, it's just so, something that we take so for granted, and we don't really pay much thought to either, because it's like, I guess there's the old kind of either or kind of thing that you kind of that we kind of think of, like, would you rather be blind or deaf? And it's like people weighing the kind of differences, and I think that I don't know if I'd rather be either of them if you had to come down to it. Like, I think it just really, it's each of them is like, has their own poses their own problems. There's no one thing that's like superior. So, but anyway, so the characters in this novel, they all quickly things when they go awry. It starts off with one guy going blind. He's 35 years old, referred to only as a blind man, which kind of strips of his identity in a sense. It's like almost like, but it's like the way he describes it is very lucid, Saramago. And it's in the middle of driving, and then somebody, a good Samaritan, or seemingly so, stops to help him, sees that he's like, I've become blind, and he's like, well, here, I'll tell you what, I'll drive you home. So he does that, but then it turns out that the good Samaritan isn't really at all what he appears to be, and he ends up stealing the car. But then he goes blind too, so it's like this thing where they're kind of all thrust together in this scenario, awful situation, and the certain things that they did in their pastime, it's like, the thief is like now kind of having to answer for those things in a different way, but it's a kind of, not karmic justice, but some kind of weird comeuppance that he gets. So it's almost like an existential novel in that sense too. But yeah, they're all, so it's basically the government kind of catches on to this, and they all kind of start to get really suspicious about people going out of bounds and like catching this thing and then having it spread like wildfire. So they're like, get all the people who are contagious and have this weird, perplexing thing that doctors, the blind man, the first scene goes to the doctors, like pretty much the first thing, and with his wife, I think, or girlfriend, and then they're both basically, like it's like a medical kind of conundrum, like to how this even happened, like how the heck do these people even catch this thing, like what's going on. It's like the doctor's like, basically going on, it's like completely thrown off guard, and like he's kind of the voice of reason throughout the novel too, is like, because he shows up again and again. But yeah, then there's the government basically puts them all in a containment camp of some kind, which is eerily kind of similar to I don't want to compare it too closely to COVID or the virus or this, but it did kind of have some similar. So I couldn't help but notice some similarities. I mean, I'm not one of those huge like anti-vaxxers or anything like that, but yeah, they're taken, and a part of you sees why, because you're like, well, if this is contagious, it does sound, the only reasonable thing too is to like at least ask people politely. But there's no, I mean, what are you going to do? Like, ask them politely? I mean, so putting in like a kind of commission and being like, okay, well, we're doing this for the better good, and being like, okay, it's a national emergency. So like, how are you going to deal with that? Like, are you going to just let them just run free and just kind of catch everyone else? So you kind of see where they're coming from. But then the other part of them is like how quickly the inhumanity and the the removal of identity and autonomy from these people, these poor people that don't even know what to do. So they're like all caged together in this place and like forced to like have tests run on them. Kind of reminded me a little bit of White Noise by Don DeLillo, except on crack. Because with the White Noise it was more of like a temporary kind of really absurd kind of like panic everybody had about this, the airborne toxic event, and people kind of just over either not taking it seriously at all or not taking it seriously enough. And this is kind of what you have a little bit with Blindness, is that there's a lot of people that are kind of thinking like, I didn't deserve this, what did I do? And then there's people with their sons or daughters that are young and they're like, they didn't deserve this either. And it's like, it's kind of like a thing where it's like, it sucks. And it's like, you can't really find a way to console that kind of attitude. So, they're all thrown together and then quickly things start to go awry. The guards basically form, like, this is probably the most uncomfortable part of the book, I'd say, is then the guards start to take advantage of not just the people in general, but the woman, using them, as like sexual favors from them in return for to getting them food and supplies, and it basically turns into, which I guess you could call a little bit of a over exaggeration, maybe because Saramago himself went through this kind of stuff and saw, he was like a part of like I guess like some political groups that were active in Portugal, and he saw up front and personal how crazy things can get, like with this kind of when people are given power, it's like the autonomy, the whole thing with anonymity too. I cannot pronounce words today. I am sorry. It's just everything is like a marble in my mouth. I'm sorry. I have to hydrate every 5 seconds. Okay. But yeah, there's it actually, a lot of it, people were pointing out the similarities with the Milgram experiment. Stanley Milgram, he was a psychiatrist of the famous Milgram experiment about the shock experiment, right? He was the one that did if you gave people the veil of anonymity and you asked them, hey, administer a shock to somebody. It doesn't have to be, obviously it's not real. The test subjects are fake, like they show up, it's like a Darren Brown kind of does this stuff too, variations of it, but no doubt probably inspired by Milgram. But with the hey, if you just press this button, this person's gonna a little bit of a shock. And then it's like, I think the more kind of like it's troublingly easy to actually kind of convince them into going up with the thing. It's like, hey, this is gonna actually cause like a heart kind of murmur, or something that very quite catastrophic if you do that. And just on the account of being, if you ask them and you're like, but hey, it's for the good of something, I don't know, science or whatever, they'll still do it. Like I can't remember exactly. But yeah, then there's the other side of it too with the Stanley, no, it was the Stanford prison experiment, sorry. It was headed by Zimbardo, I think, in the 60s. And I definitely don't agree with his kind of the way he went about things at all, because he just kind of seemed to like let things go beyond the pale of like what was necessary whatsoever. Like it's just like, and I haven't gone too in the weeds on this, but like it has been a while though since I've learned about it in like an intro to psych class. But yeah, it has been. I do remember it being very brutal, like the way that how the prison guards, if you gave them, hey, a job with the students, basically giving them a job, and you give enough time to kind of whittle down their defenses, they're like, it's disconcertingly not that long before they start to harbor bloodlust or dominance and various things. Like even like I think at one point like some of them were willing or even to the point of sodomizing one of their prisoners. So it's crazy just how, because that kind of paints people in a bad light. It's just like humans, like we are, or men in general, like we're horrible people. in a sense, this is kind of like where I might disagree with a little bit with this book and Saramago in a little bit, is just that, are these just isolated scenarios? Like, is it really that bad? Like, are people, if you give them a little bit of power, are they gonna like if you give them an inch, they give a mile, or like, are they gonna give back? So are they gonna turn the tables and then suddenly seize power? And I totally understand. I totally understand if you're like in a more broken, tumultuous kind of area. Not to say that all of South America is like this, but I have heard various things about that, or San Salvador too, as with that, or Joan Didion's case on like the violence rampant, and especially in the 80s, and especially following the earthquake that happened, that especially troubling, or the one that ended up kind of like with the most casualties, I think, in like years and years. It was like a record high Richter scale, I think. But yeah, it's like I think it was a 9 point on the Richter scale. Anyway, but there's so much, excuse me. There's so much, like, unsettling. There's so much, like, once like nationalities are kind of like torn apart and they don't have any roots really. Maybe it's easy for me to say because America's kind of like, maybe they're more kind of, I don't know. There's like maybe it's just where I come from. Like, it's like I do see some instances where people are willing to go like to the extreme to do something, or like I have seen people being taken advantage of, or led down the wrong path, and it's just like all screwed up. And then I also have seen other things, like people just being beneficent and nice for no other reason than just to be nice. Or so it just I'm not sure. It's like, if it is a little bit pessimistic one might say it's realistic, but hey. But anyway, so yeah, Blindness. To continue on, spoiler alert, there is one of the nurses kind of exacts vengeance on one of the guards that basically forced, basically raped and taken advantage of all these women, and ends up cutting his throat, I think, with a scissors. And it's quite violent, like the way it's described. I'm not gonna lie, it was like hard to get through this part. And yeah, because she was blind, or like because blindness is such a, she's able to kind of get away with it in a way. But it's like, it's kind of like a crime and punishment thing with like Raskolnikov, where it's like somebody so, this is like a little bit more of a relatable than I'd say like Raskolnikov, because she was like a life or death situation with some of these people. Like it wasn't life or death quite yet. It was like they're getting advantage of. She could have like I guess like saved it for saved that kind of wrath for later, but like that kind of exacting kind of cutting off of that person that was being so overtly horrible, and just like dehumanizing them, just belittling them to the point where they were just sex objects and nothing more than that. And this is what this whole entire scenario of like, this is the kind of Good Samaritans you see. Is like the first Good Samaritan you see is a thief that steals they take advantage of this blind man's car, and then the first kind of and then the prison guards, which are supposed to be sworn arbiters of duty and respect and and vigilance, are now throwing those to the wolves. And there is a bit of a thing too with like another correlation to history of like the Nazis, and the fact that like a lot of the SS Schaffenwald were at least the ones that went in to kind of liquidize the ghetto. A lot of those people were, like in the book Christopher Brown wrote, I think it's called Ordinary Men, and he points out that a lot of them are actually just kind of average guys. Like they weren't gung-ho, and they weren't on fire and ecstatic about Hitler necessarily. They were like kind of either indifferent. Some of them weren't like big on him. But yeah, this idea of like, if the second you banalize something, like you make something banal and irrelevant, or irreverent, I guess. The second you take away like the risk or the notion of responsibility, like I think this once that is once those kind of structures are taken out of order, I think, not to sound like a kind of conservative person, but it's like it kind of does lay the ground. It does, because the people in this novel, like anonymity plays a big part, especially with losing your vision. And like just pale white is the only thing you see, is like everything is completely pale white, and it's it just like completely gives way to disaster and entropy on every level. And because of that, it's like kind of like that's how things end that way. It's like because it's like people chose the kind of expedient kind of route over the morally ethically correct one. So yeah, there's probably something I'm missing there. But yeah, definitely. I did like the last sentence, the last like kind of paragraph, and how it kind of eases off into, because there is like a pretty beautiful part that kind of, it gets like quite, the characters kind of have moments where they grow, and they, they're this, and it, why I like to say it's kind of existential is because it reminds me a bit of like Camus' works, like, or Sartre's a little bit, this idea of being thrust in a absurd scenario, but in that growing as a collective and actually coming out the other side kind of better off in some weird way. It's like, not to say that you would actually wish this upon anybody, but the fact that you can walk away from this with gleaning some new light. So but yeah, the last paragraph here is the hopefully the albatross will not come to poke out your eyes. The dog had come closer and closer, and was almost touching the superintendent's knees with its nose. It was looking at him with the eyes, and was saying, "I won't hurt you. Don't be afraid." She wasn't when I found her on that other day. Then the superintendent reached slowly out of his hand and touched the dog's head. He felt like carrying the letter and letting the tears course down his face. Perhaps the marvel would be repeated. The doctor's wife would put her book away in a bag and say, "Let's go." "And let's go where?" asked the superintendent. "You'll have lunch with us, won't you, if you have nothing more important to do?" "Are you sure?" "About what?" "That you won't have me sitting at your table?" "Yes, I'm sure." "And you're not afraid I might be tricking you?" "No." "With those tears in your eyes?" "No." So yeah, there's a kind of almost an acceptance of the inevitable, like, people are going to get sick. People are, just because we've kind of walked away from this whole blindness thing with, like, on the other side, miraculously, people are still, gonna get sick, and they're gonna come to the doctor, and it's gonna, same thing's gonna repeat. It's like, it's just on varying levels. Obviously, it's not like as bad, but yeah, I just really like that kind of end sentiment, was like, without being too sentimental or unrealistic, and kind of retaining that kind of wry, a little bit more of a pessimistic kind of Schopenhauerian way of looking at things, but also not without being completely, deferring to that irony as well. So, Blindness by José Saramago. Definitely recommend it. And yeah, thanks for watching.